So we're starting the text Form, Information, and Potentials from Gilbert Simondon, and it's so we actually don't have the text itself here in this translation. So the text itself is in the individuation book. So we'll get to that eventually, but we have here the summary and the discussion. So this was presented at a meeting, I forget, like the French Philosophical Society or something like that. And there was discussion of Simondon's presentation. And so the text itself is almost like a summary of the individuation book, the general framework of that book, without all the sort of concrete analyses that are used in the book itself. So here we have just a sort of a presentation of the theses. So he describes it as an axiomatic or axiomatization. So it's just a sort of presentation of the theses without the concrete analyses that support it in the book. Okay, so I'll start the reading. We can read one paragraph at a time, or one question and answer at a time once we get to the discussion portion. I don't think we need to do a whole like dramatization of the discussion portion, but you know, yeah, I know it's no fun, but yeah, we can just read I think one question and answer together will make sense, but we'll see how it goes. So I'll start reading. So Mr. Gilbert Simondon, professor at the University of Poitiers, had proposed to develop before the members of the society the following arguments. The absence of a general theory of the human sciences and psychology encourages reflexive thought to seek the conditions of a possible axiomatization. In view of this work, which necessarily involves a certain amount of invention and cannot be the result of a pure synthesis, it is necessary to bring to light the main conceptual systems that have been used without granting privileges to the most recent. The discoveries of chemical theory in the early 19th century have taken up atomic schemes that were defined more than 20 centuries ago and have enriched them with the contribution of weight analysis. Thus one could, in a similar way, revive the principles of indefinite dyad, archetype, form, and matter, and bring them closer to the recent explanatory models of the psychology of form than those of cybernetics and information theory, going as far as using notions from the physical sciences, such as that of potential. We would like to show that an axiomatic sketch of the human sciences, or at least of psychology, is possible if we try to grasp together the three notions of form, information, and potential, provided we combine them and internally organize the definition of an operation, which appears when there is form, information, and potential, transductive operation. So he defines this, his project here, as an axiomatization. So I think we should understand this maybe in a little bit of a metaphorical sense, because he's not setting out explicit axioms and deducing consequences from them in the way that Euclid does or something like that, or Spinoza, of course, in philosophy. What he's doing is he's setting out these fundamental principles. He's positing these principles as fundamental, and rather than giving an argument for these principles, he's presenting the principles first and then showing what follows from those principles afterwards. So the idea here, he's I guess using the analogy of the atomic theory, which of course was presented in a philosophical form in ancient Greece in Democritus and the Epicurean school. They had a theory of atoms in the void and of the formation of the composite bodies out of atoms. But that was a philosophical theory, and then it was not really widely accepted throughout most of the intervening centuries until in the early 19th century. It's revived and then it's made more precise and becomes a scientific theory by the use of what here is called weight analysis or ponderal analysis. Weighing very precisely the different components that go into a chemical reaction. This was used to basically to show that the chemical reaction just combines the elements that were present at the beginning of the reaction. And so there's a conservation of mass from the beginning through the whole operation. So Simondon was taking this as a sort of model for how we can revive notions from ancient philosophy, or ancient notions in general. We can take them and revive them by combining them with contemporary scientific developments, and we can introduce new schemas of thought in this way, or revive these schemas of thought. And so he's proposing to take these notions of form, the indefinite dyad, archetype, form, and matter. So these are all related to the concept of form, as we'll see in the next paragraph. And then combine those with the modern notions of information drawn from information theory and cybernetics, and then the notion of potential drawn from physics, and then to sort of join all of these three notions together is the new notion that he's presenting here of a transductive operation. So that's the sort of big picture of what's going on in this paragraph.
What is the psychology of form that he mentions?
Right. Yeah. So this is what's called Gestalt psychology. So this was a school that arose right at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. So it basically arose in opposition to the predominant associationist tradition within psychology. So the tradition that wanted to show how mental life is made up out of elements, atoms, psychological atoms, like maybe color sensations or something like that would become associated together through different psychological principles of association, like contiguity or causality, and so on. And so it would try to build up mental life out of these psychological atoms that would combine together. So the Gestalt school opposed that associationist tradition, and they argued that there are inherent forms within psychological life or within the mind. So in the perception of a melody, for example, there's a perception of the form, the whole structure of the melody, which is prior to the perception of any particular note. And so you can, for example, if you change one note in the melody, you change the whole melody, the whole structure of the melody. Whereas if you take the whole melody up an octave or down an octave, you preserve the structure of the melody in a way that isn't preserved when you just change one note. And another example is in visual perception. They argued that there was visual perception always involved a form and background distinction, or figure and background. So there's several famous optical illusions that they first presented that involve, for example, there's one with a circle with what looks like a white triangle in front of it, but there's no actual triangle drawn on the page. It's just the sort of cut out outlines of the circle that we interpreted as a white triangle on top of a circle. And so this is the figure ground structure is a form that our perception imposes on the worlds, or on our sense impressions, or however you want to present that.
Okay, thank you for that explanation.
Yeah, and so Simondon is going to, so Gestalt psychology, or psychology of form, is one of the sort of key reference points for Simondon. And he takes this to be a reactualization of the ancient Greek notion of form, and that we find in Plato and Aristotle in different forms or different ways. So he takes this as an essential reference point. Oh yeah, and Laith Mason just posted into the chat, the live discussion chat channel, one of the famous optical illusion of the duck rabbit. So you can see the same figure as either a duck or a rabbit, depending on how you organize it. I'm not sure if that was one of the ones that the Gestalt psychologists had proposed. There's one that's called the Canister Triangle. Let me see if I can find it.
I don't see the rabbit.
So the rabbit is sideways, like the ears are the duck's bill, and
oh, okay, now I do. Sorry, I'm always bad at these things.
Oh yeah, that's the one. Yeah, so the Canister Triangle. So you see, it looks like a white triangle over top of the black circles and the black outline triangle underneath it, but there's really no white triangle drawn on the paper. It's just the outlines are sort of sketched by the cutout on the remaining shapes. Okay, I think we can go on to the next paragraph if someone else would like to read.
I'll read. The notion of form in all the doctrines in which it appears plays a constant functional role, that of a structural germ possessing a certain directing and organizing power. It supposes a basic duality between two types of reality, the reality that receives the form and the one that is the form or conceals the form. This privilege of form resides in its unity, its totality, its essential coherence with itself. Even in Gestalt psychology, form, which is no longer anterior to any matter, nevertheless retains its superiority of Ganzheit, and there is a hierarchy of forms, good form, better form, immanent or transcendent prior to the taking of form or contemporary with this operation. It retains its privilege of superiority over the matter or the elements. What is the foundation of any archetypal, halomorphic, or gestaltist theory of form is the qualitative, functional, and hierarchical asymmetry of form and what takes shape.
Yeah, take shape there should be maybe takes form. The word in French is forme, so that's I would just translate it as form. And then also the word Ganzheit, that's a German term for wholeness. So that's one of the properties of the form in Gestalt psychology is that it has a wholeness to it. It's not composed out of elements that are combined together. It's the whole is prior to the elements, so that's why we see the triangle rather than seeing circles with little pie slices cut out of them or something like that. And so he goes through this very quickly here because this is just a summary. But he mentions sort of three different ways in which we can, or three different theories of the form. So the archetypal, hylomorphic, or gestaltist theory of form. So the three different theories of form. So the archetypal refers to Plato. So this is the theory of the form as the archetype from which particular entities are copied. And Plato uses different images for this in different dialogues. But the image that Simondon retains is the one of the coin, the coin being stamped. So you have this is in the form information potential text itself. It's not developed here so far, but so the image is of you have an engraving carved, engraved into a metal piece, and you use it to stamp coins. So all the coins will resemble each other because they're all derived from the one archetype, the stamp. So this is the Platonic theory of the form, and the hylomorphic theory is Aristotle's theory. So this is a theory in which the form is inherent in the entities themselves, the Sunolan, the whole entity, and the form is in this theory is related to the becoming of the entity. So the form is that towards which the entity becomes. So in the way that an acorn grows into a tree, so it has this form of the tree within it. And then the Gestaltist theory of form is the one that we've discussed here with the psychological properties that the form precedes the elements in psychical life. And so the basic concept of the basic property of a concept of form that Simondon wants to retain is this idea of what he calls the asymmetry of form and what takes on the form. So there's something that imposes or that generates the form, and there's something that undergoes the process of transformation that takes on the form. And there's an asymmetry between the two. So this is sort of the key takeaway of this paragraph. Okay, we can go on to the next paragraph if someone else would like to read.
I can go. 2. The notion of information is, on the contrary, the keystone of any doctrine of reciprocity, equivalence, or even the reversibility of the active term and the passive term in the exchange. The transmitter and the receiver are the two homogeneous ends of a line. Starting again. The transmitter and the receiver are the two homogeneous ends of a line in which the information is transmitted with maximum safety when the operation is reversible. It is not only a matter of control, but also the condition of intelligibility itself, which implies reversibility and univocity. Coding and decoding are carried out according to conventions that apply to both the transmitter and the receiver. Only a content and not a code can be transmitted. Any type of explanation involving symmetry can be associated with information theory, the homogeneity of the elements that combine and take shape through an additive or juxtaposition process. More generally, quantitative phenomena of mass, population, based on the theory of randomness, assuming the symmetry of the elements and their arbitrary nature, can be studied in information theory.
So he's here referring to information theory as developed by Shannon and Weaver and Norbert Wiener as well. So one of the basic idea of information theory in this form is a calculation of probability of messages. So you have a receiver and a transmitter, and the transmitter has certain possible states. The most simple would be a 1 and a 0, or heads or tails, or something like that. The message transmits the state of the transmitter, and then the receiver, the message transmits it in the form of a code. So it has some sort of signal, whether it's change of voltage or whatever in a telegraph cable, or change of frequency in radio waves or whatever. Some sort of signal codes the different possible states of the transmitter, and then the receiver receives the information based on what those possible states are, and you can calculate the amount of information based on the probabilities of the different states of the transmitter given a certain message, because there's always noise in the channel, so there's always a certain amount of uncertainty. So this is the sort of so that's there's a nice diagram here that Leif Mason has posted in the chat. So you have some sort of information source, whether it's it can be something random or some information source that's already been prepared in some way. Then you have a transmitter which transmits a signal across a channel. and then there's always noise in the channel, and then the receiver receives the signal through the channel, and then he has to decode the signal. Sorry, has to decode the message from the signal.
I have some information theory journals, and it's very difficult to understand what's going on. I mean, it's all about like signal to noise ratio and stuff in every case, but the mathematics is far more complicated than all of the mathematics journals that I've looked at. At least from, I mean, maybe they're maybe not mathematically more complicated, but the symbolically more complicated, I guess, at least in information theory papers.
I posted a book a while back, I guess last year now, called by Donald McKay, called Mechanism and Meaning, I think it's called, something like that. I'm going to repost it. It's a really good sort of series of lectures that kind of build off one another, describing the sort of broader import of information theory in a way that's got some useful metaphors in it. I'll post it in. Yeah,
and so this information theory develops, I think, in the 40s and 50s, sort of laid the foundation for telecommunications and a lot of computer networking, and exactly what we're doing right now, of course, is made possible by information theory. So this is obviously a very significant technological development, but there's also Simondon wants to draw the theoretical consequences of this notion of information, and one of those consequences is, by contrast to the notion of form that he presented in the last paragraph. So the notion of form is an asymmetrical notion. On the other hand, the notion of information is a symmetrical one, in the sense that the receiver and the emitter, the receiver and the emitter of a message can be reversed insofar as they operate on the same code. So the code is common to the receiver and the transmitter, and because of that, you can always reverse the receiver and transmitter.
Here, I uploaded. This is an article in the most recent like information theory journal, the big one. It's can give you kind of an idea of like how much like formal symbolic language is used to talk about these types of codes in communication.
Wow, this looks so convoluted.
Yeah, it's fun stuff. The sort of basic principles are relatively simple, but it quickly becomes complicated once you start applying it to practical cases. And of course, the more complexities. So, like the example I was giving was just something like a flip of a coin being the message to be transmitted, and so you would have a very simple code of on or off. But the more complex the message is, so if you want to transmit images or video or something like that, then you need a much more complex code, and so you would have the actual information. The calculation of the information transmitted would be much more complex as well.
Don't look too closely at the paper if you have some issues with that, especially Aeon. Be careful looking at that last thing I linked, because it might make you like hate the world or something. Like a lot of people have this experience. They just look and they're like, no. It's just like this, like the information just like builds up and like buries them under it, information theoretic constraints, I guess. But this is why it's crucial for Simondon to be talked about, because the current like dialogue about this is so delegated to technical expertise when that's not entirely necessary. Like we don't have to think about information theory in a way that we would have to dedicate our lives to understanding mathematical principles behind them just to have a bearing in what's going on. So I think that this is one of the main reasons why it's really good to look into Simondon, because he's not explaining information theory in just purely mathematical terms. It's much more ecumenical in that aspect, I guess.
Yeah, I think he takes from information theory what the sort of conceptual core of it is, or what conceptual implications it has, rather than staying with the formalism of the theory itself. He sort of draws out its implications for us. Okay, we can read the next paragraph then, if someone else would like to volunteer.
I can do this one. Transductive operation would be the propagation of a structure gradually gaining space from a structural germ as a supersaturated solution crystallizes from a crystalline germ. This implies that the field is in a metastable equilibrium, i.e. conceals a potential energy that can only be released by the emergence of a new structure, which is like solving the problem. Consequently, the information is not reversible. It is the organizing direction emanating at a short distance from the structural germ and reaching the field. The germ is the sender, the field is the receiver, and the boundary between sender and receiver moves continuously when the shape occurs as it progresses. One could say that the boundary between the structural germ and the structural metastable field is a modulator. It is the energy of metastability of the field, therefore of matter, that allows the structure, therefore the form, to advance. The potentials reside in matter, and the boundary between form and matter is an amplifier relay.
So a kind of empty modular domain for the form matter distinction, I guess. Kind of the form is, in this case, the structure, the form. But I guess the key is that the formlessness is modular and metastable, right?
Modular.
Yeah, there's a lot of notions sort of packed into this paragraph. So maybe to start with would be the notion of metastability. That's probably the first one to clarify. So the metastability, I posted a diagram ages ago when we were talking about this, but one, I guess, simple model of what this looks like is if you have a ball at the top of a hill. So the ball might not, it is in a stable state in some sense, in the sense that it's not moving, but it's also it's a metastable state because it has potential energy in that if you just give the ball a slight push, it'll roll down the hill, so a metastable state is a state that in which there is potential energy, so that transformation or work can be carried out, but it's a sort of provisionally stable state that contains this potential energy, and so a transductive operation, as Simondon outlines it here, is an operation. Yes, and Berkay has just posted an image in the chat there, which shows the ball in a metastable state that it can roll down this incline, but it's stable for now. It's a provisionally stable state, but it can roll down this incline if it's given a slight push. So this is a sort of the most simple image of a metastable state, but you can have other forms of potential energy rather than just gravity. So the notion of a transductive operation is, so it starts from a field of some kind, whether it's a magnetic or gravitational or whatever other form of field, which contains a potential energy, and then the operation proceeds from some sort of germ, like in the crystallization example. So crystals will form in a supersaturated solution, out of a germ crystal. So if you have a crystal, a tiny fragment of a crystal, and you insert it into a supersaturated solution, then the solution will start to crystallize around the germ crystal that you introduce into it. So the transductive operation is the operation of the progressive taking on of structure within this field. So the structure is not the structure arises out of the field through this transductive operation, and the limit between the germ and the field is what he calls the modulator. So the term modulator is drawn from electronics, in which you can have a signal and then a modulating signal. So it's a secondary signal that transforms the first signal. So you can have like in radio, you have amplitude modulation for AM radio and frequency modulation for FM radio. But you have a sort of a base signal and then some sort of modulating signal that modifies the base signal. And so Simondon is representing the transformation at the limit of the structural germ as a kind of modulation.
Also, if y'all are interested in the phenomenological tradition, there's a relevant sense of multi-stability in which the idea of perception is kind of tasked with this this multi-stable relation. Let me see the exact characterization. I have a quote on hand, actually. Because perceptual objects are contexted, and because these contexts change with it the object role, we may see that all perceptual objects are multi-stable. They may assume variations within variant contexts, but are invariantly located in some ratio with the field or context. And that's a quote from, like, I guess someone who's considered a post-phenomenologist, but somebody who's interested in kind of looking at like the kind of metastability kind of explanatory model in the terms of phenomenological explanation. And you can kind of see the optical illusion and the marble rolling situation in a similar sense. If you can think of our perception as like active, if we can think of our perception as something which can manifest potentials, right? And I think if we have a certain kind of epistemic framework, then we can kind of tie in the multi-stability of like the information theoretic world with the phenomenological domain.
Yeah, and in the paper itself that we don't have here, but we'll eventually get to, he refers to the work of Kurt Lewin, who was a Gestalt psychologist who developed the idea of psychological fields. So the idea that the experienced world is structured in a topological way. So there's like a forward field and I don't know too much about it, but there's a sort of structure. The experienced world is structured in terms of fields and that have different potentials sort of inherent in them. And so this same model of metastability and the transductive operation applies in both in physical transformations like the crystal, and also in psychological transformations like the process of indention that he analyzes in some of his lecture courses.
That's actually who I was quoting, Laith. Sorry to interrupt, but
yeah, that's fine. I thought that might be who you were referring to. We can go on to the next paragraph, the last one before we get to the discussion itself.
I can go. Is it the one starting with mass phenomena?
Yes, that's the one.
Okay. Mass phenomena are not to be neglected in any way, but they must be considered as conditions for the accumulation of potential energy in a field, and strictly speaking, conditions for the creation of the field as a possible field of transductivity, which means a relative homogeneity and a part-by-part distribution of the energetic potentials. The form-matter relation is then transposed into a transductive relation and progress of the structuring-structured couple through an active limit, which is the passage of information.
So mass phenomena here are what he referred to in the paragraph on information theory as having to do with chance or probability. And Simondon suggests here that this is a sort of secondary importance, not rejected in a sense, but they're secondary in that what is taken into account in the theory is the potential energy in the field, and the mass phenomena or these chance or probabilistic operations are what create the conditions in the field. And so again, this is all very compressed because it's just a summary of the article or the paper that he presented. But in the paper itself, Simondon argues for the need for something like a tension of information, as he calls it. So there's not just information wouldn't just have a single quantity, the quantity of information transmitted, but there would be what he calls this tension of information, which is what is characteristic of the good form in the Gestalt psychology sense. It's something that has a high tension of information, and this tension of information is characterized by its ability to structure an environment. So it's something that something has high tension of information insofar as it is capable of structuring a field.
So information theoretic could be considered as like field constructive, right?
So information theoretic in this new sense that Simondon is developing. So he's arguing for this new form of information, or this new what he calls tension of information, as being the property of being able to structure a field.
So could we say, just riffing off of what 61 is saying, that could we say that traditional information theory is somehow field presumptive, and that's maybe it's one of its limitations?
Well, I think the language of like what field tensors, or is that what what was the Simondon's it was tension or is that related to tensor?
I don't think he's referring specifically to tensors as used in like relativity or something like that. But I think the notion has to do with an electrical field which has a potential energy and a tension. So there's two quantities associated with the field, so he argues in the same way that we have to understand information as having two distinct quantities, or he also calls it a qualitative dimension, as opposed to a purely quantitative dimension in terms of information theory as the quantity of information. And so this is why. So I guess maybe to explain a little bit more. The issue is that the transmission of information has to do with uncertainty, and so the more uncertainty there is regarding the state of the emitter, the more information is transmitted, and the more there's a shared the more is shared between the emitter and receiver, the less information is transmitted. And so on this conception of information theory, or of the transmission of information, if the receiver and the emitter come to coincide, if they share the same form, then there's no information transmitted, or it's not possible to transmit information. And that's the lowest state of information transmission. And Simondon argues that we need an alternate notion of information to make sense of the way that the Gestalt psychological forms, or forms in that sense, are transmitted from one subject to another, or one technological entity to another. So we have to have some sort of sense in which the transmission of a form would be the most information transmission rather than the least information transmission. And this is where he introduces this notion of the tension of information. So this would be the capacity to structure a field. And this is something that would be especially characteristic of these Gestalt forms.
Well, I very much like your exposition on that and giving shape to it. Can you talk a little bit about the, and maybe I missed it, it was discussed or mentioned earlier, about these Gestalt forms? Or is that what we're setting out to try to theorize, what the Gestalt forms?
We did talk about it a little bit earlier. If you scroll up a little bit in the chat, you see a little diagram with a triangle and 3 black circles with little pieces cut out of them. And so that's an instance of the way that the Gestalt forms structure perception. So because of the way that our perceptual apparatus is structured, we perceive all of our perception has the figure ground distinction sort of built into it, and so we perceive a white triangle over top of a black outline triangle and 3 circles, even though there's no white triangle drawn on the page. So some of these optical illusions are instances of that where we can sort of draw out these forms that are inherent in our perceptual capacity, the sort of principle is that the form precedes the elements that make it up. So rather than having these elements that are then composed to make up forms, we have forms that take on these different elements, or that take on that appear in perception.
Also, he mentions and when he talks about Gestalt in his paper, he talks about the Gestalt still retains the Ganz height, and this is loosely kind of like the total aspect of the Gestalt. So it's the idea is, in like, if you have I always reduce this to optical illusions because I have a phenomenological bias in this, but if you can imagine 2 different, like a multi-stable, 2 different stable states. So you would have an image which you can have, there are 2 different stable interpretive states. Like you look at it one way and it's like a triangle, and you look at it another way and it's like a bunch of lines, or the rabbit and the duck. The rabbit and the duck are both these stable states of perceptive equilibrium. But Simondon is saying that there is also this total, that there is a stability of that those 2 things are just parts of. I mean, here I might be slightly off of my interpretive framework, but it seems like he's establishing a kind of like part-whole contiguity, so that we can't just separate 2 different stable equilibriums of interpretation, or 2 different stable, state manifestations of potential, I guess would be more general way to put it. But there has to be the idea of the Gestalt totality. and this is common. And when people talk about Gestalt, they're not just saying that there's like a multiplicity of different interpretive positions, or there's multiple different, I guess, actualizations. I guess if I'm not sure exactly the non-phenomenological way to talk about it, but I think that the Gestalt totality is saying that there is a collection of different interpretations that nonetheless constitutes one singular object. So I don't know if non-manifest, if you wanted to talk about the Ganzheit, the way he uses it in his paper in relation to like the totality and the Gestalt.
Yeah, I mean, I can just sort of briefly. I mean, I'm not really that well versed in Gestalt psychology. I probably mostly know about it from Simondon, actually. But Ganzheit means wholeness. Like Ganz is a whole, so the idea is that these forms that the forms that Gestalt psychology has to do with have this property of wholeness, in the sense that the whole precedes the parts that make it up. So there's no, rather than building up the whole out of the parts, the whole is primary, and the parts just sort of fill in that whole.
Okay, that seems like it might be, for me, it's posing a little bit of a conflict with the idea of the field that I think, in trying to develop an understanding of what was talked about in regards to the field, that it was a kind of ground in which potentialities and probabilities of signals or other emerging properties can be recognized by both the emitter and the sender. So I don't know if there's a kind of boundary or asymptotic limit to the field that would probably allow for the wholeness, but it seems like there may be a slight conflict in conceptions where the field doesn't have like a boundary or a limit to its wholeness. It's just
Yeah, so the wholeness or Ganzheit is a property of the form, not of the field. So the field is not presented as having a limit. It, I guess, would just be a sort of an indefinite. But the forms have this property of being able to structure a field. And so the field would take on the form. So it's the forms that have the property of wholeness, not the field.
okay. Yeah, because I'm trying to translate this in my mind to deal with like natural language, aspects of natural language, which I think they will talk about towards the end of the panel discussion there. I noticed that, but
yeah.
So in terms of translating this images, because it seems like the ambiguity that's built into the Gestalt is what I'm trying to formulate here, of how that may have an analog in language, where you have, let's say, a word embedding or a syntactic embedding chunk of various words that may have more than one interpretation, and what constrains that, because I think that there's a lot of sort of physics or engineering vocabulary that's being used to talk about certain constraints on information to be able to deal with the noise part of the signals. So it's interesting. I'm just not sure yet how to reconcile the transfer from the visual field to the language field just yet.
You know, it actually has an article about this that might be. But are you interested in like the natural language processing kind of implications of like the multi-stable?
Yeah. Yes.
I think that in terms of this might be cashed out in terms of like interpretations and kind of hermeneutics, I guess more generally. That kind of questions in natural language processing about like interpretability invoke a certain totality that has embedded stable equilibriums of interpretive of interpretation. Like always leave an extra word at the end that I don't use. So that, like, for instance, if you use one word, or if your algorithm puts out one word, there may be two different interpretive frameworks that make sense for that. Or if your natural language process is inputting one term, it could say, take that term as linearly corresponded to something, or using a predictive model, it could try to figure out what was going on there. Or but there's a sense in which, like, if that is geared towards like a linear interpretation, so like you could say, find the most likely interpretation of this word or something like that, right? Then this would be aiming for a singular stable equilibrium state of interpretation. Whereas if you were to say, find a sequence of, or a collection of viable equilibrium states of interpretive clarity. So there would be multiple interpretive angles, which you could say, well, if you look at it in this sense, the meaning of these words could be X, Y, or Z. And if you look at it in this sense, the meaning of these words could be M, N, and O. And then you could see these both as potentially stable interpretive states. And you could kind of derive from this kind of foundational totality that both these interpretations are part of like a single fundamental interpretation that is kind of the linear, kind of the most, that would answer the question, like, what would be the most adequate translation or interpretation of this sentence, if you were going to translate one string into another sequence of strings. So that, I guess, I think that I'm not used to talking about it, but I'm trying my hardest.
I think you're on the right track to a certain extent, but in terms of comparing it to the visual field, I was thinking, like, with these Gestalt images, like the duck and the rabbit, I feel like there could be an experimental case where, as the object is being viewed and the viewer moves his position in the particular space or field, then the Gestalt is either constrained in one direction or the other, where it's like, so there's all this stuff that's going on in the field of vision with light and coordinates that will then morph into one of the two images. And I think with language too, there's the question around space. I mean, as a field, in order to extract the communicative aspect, in this case, the meaning, but it's pretty complicated. The dimension of that space is complicated, and so I think in many ways you're pointing to the embedding idea in terms of the linearity and distances within the space of what's called word embeddings, which is the vectorization of particular words. But language has other increasing complexity as it becomes compositional, and though it has like a linear form, at least in English for the most part, and as far as sound synthesis goes, one can model it as linear. It is these other abstractional layers that then get activated in the space. You know, like the meaning, and then things in the space itself, various particles or packets, are having an influence on either one word or a concatenation of two words or a concatenation of three words, and that gives it its composition. And though it's like a linear string, but at the same time it's kind of moving through the space around various other packets, which are either constrained by the system, and in this case the human being on either side, sender or receiver, has a program of language, a very complex program that it is constantly configuring both the string and then all the particles around the string.
Yeah, I think we've noticed in when we were reading the technology book, on the mode of existence of technical objects, we noticed in that book that there's kind of a noteworthy absence of language as a topic of discussion. So Simondon doesn't really talk much about language. There is a sort of in passing mention in the actual text of form information and potentials that we don't have here. And I think you mentioned there's some discussion in the discussion section. Yeah, so language is not really one of the sort of themes that Simondon develops in his work. It's not one of his sort of main areas of discussion. But it would be interesting to try to extend some of his concepts into the linguistic sphere and see how they apply.
Right. Well, I mean, both of these spheres are relevant to the work now that's being done in terms of the techniques, computational techniques, AI, however we want to describe it. I mean, the visual field and the field of language, which isn't necessarily just natural language. So I think even though he might not be taking on natural language, he is talking about kind of the physics having particular processes which on an abstract layer do have a something akin to a language in the formal sense.
Okay.
So yeah. So there's a lot of translation that can be done. By that I mean on an abstract layer of, you guys understand what I'm talking about, not translating the concept across field.
I think I understand kind of like the area that you're talking about, even if I can't track exactly every word, but I'm mostly I want to kind of think of this as like a potential benefit of Simondon and learning about this is that it can be applied in areas outside of where he was originally interested in applying it. In the sense, for instance, considering language as an object is something that like a contemporary philosophy of language is sometimes interested in doing, like the Platonist linguistics school of Gerald Katz, for instance, who worked with Fodor and Chomsky in the mid 20th century. He has the idea of language as an abstract object. And if you have the idea of language as an abstract object, then I think that's very amenable to considering it to be an object of technical form. And so I don't think that this is at all different than what Simondon would have found to be warranted by his project. I think that that expanding our philosophy of technology arguments into the domain of philosophy of language is something which is very underutilized as a strategy.
Okay. Yeah, well, I definitely am in agreement with you. The study of language as an object is kind of what the science of linguistics post-1950s was all about, and Shannon's work was influential. Fodor took it on in terms of understanding the idea of semantics as information that has kind of a packet possibility of the packet form of information, which was utilized in terms of the internet and the way there's a header on a packet, so there's an encapsulation of information, and all these have kind of interesting theoretical implications for natural language as well, and some of them may have come from linguistics as well in certain ways, and there is like a few experimental theoreticians out there that talk about like the supra-linguistic field where generalized principles from the study of language may have an influence on other sciences.
Oh yeah, certainly. I think there's also a turning tide in contemporary epistemology as well, about being less focused on knowledge and more focused on information. I guess you could see the Hintika's Socratic epistemology book as kind of continuing in this type of project. But there's a lot of, I mean, it's very popular nowadays to be kind of somewhat deflationary about knowledge centrism, I guess I would call it, in epistemology. And I think that part of that knowledge centrism is kind of this idea of language as this propositional form, which has there's specific rules. So it's kind of there's this implicit propositional aspect to knowledge claims that is very, very common in epistemology. And I think that leading away from that is a kind of way to naturalize philosophy of language, naturalize epistemology, I guess, even to be like Quinian about it.
And I don't know if this is in parallel to, and we're going off topic here, but just the last point is that there has been the major disruption, though, in language studies based on neural network, perceptrons and stuff like that. That has very much contested and challenged modern linguistics in many ways. And now there is more recently a turn back to having a symbolic layer on top of the perceptron layer for the to try to attempt at improving the real world knowledge of some of these artificial systems. So it's an ongoing effort.
Oh yeah, definitely. Then the naturalist tendency is very, very strong and continues to be so. And the project of resorting to what best scientists have said about X, Y, and Z as a kind of to form our bearing in a particular area of inquiry, I think leads us to information theory constraints and taking the types of things Simondon is saying here seriously.
Shall we read the next paragraph?
Yes, please.
I was just about to say, this is interesting, but I do think we should return to the text, and we can go on to the next paragraph. So maybe you can read the question and answer.
Yeah, I was going to say, are we going to pick out roles and we can read? If so, I call record. I want to do the record part.
I think we decided it would be, or I decided by it that the probably the easiest way is just to read one question and answer together, rather than having people sort of act out the parts. But I don't know, maybe if everyone is really into the dramatization version of it, we could do that instead. I don't know.
I like to pretend I'm a French philosopher. Just my thing. I don't know. I don't feel very strongly about it though either way.
Nor do I, despite having suggested it. at the start.
Okay, let's just read one. Let's get one person to read the question and answer. I think it's probably the easiest way to do it.
I'll go. I thank Mr. Simondon very much for his very rich and very original presentation. And so that the audience has time to ask questions, I open the discussion immediately, abbreviating my thanks and congratulations, which are nonetheless very sincere. I really admire Mr. Simondon's construction. I would like to ask a question. Isn't the psychosocial field about to arrive at a unitary theory? This might seem paradoxical compared to the current state of physical theories and the efforts of their authors to build a cosmic unitary theory. It could go far, who knows, by leading us perhaps to predict that in the next 5 centuries in such a galaxy, novae or supernova will be formed. It is true that, more modestly, the unitary effort may be limited to seeking among 30 or so physical constants relations which could make it possible to extract numerically from a small number of them, something that is still difficult. To appreciate such a difficulty, it is good to compare the cosmic theme to a more down-to-earth theme by simply studying the movement of water in various conditions. There we find that there is no unitary theory given the existence of unstable regimes excluding all determinism. On the contrary, the existence of more normal regimes introduces cases governed by determinism. So it's not possible to arrive at a unitary hydrodynamic theory. On the other hand, in the psychosocial field, your presentation gives an attractive basis to perspectives of unitary theory. I would add that you spoke of a tension that sometimes puts us in social evolution on the brink of a hard blow, yet avoided in the end. Now, this fact, a curious thing, has found itself in the study of the formal system of logic. We have seen it blossomed from Hilbert, hoping to escape numerous paradoxes. Then, following the work of Jean-Le Louvain in the internal limitations of formalism, we see this, starting from a paradox such as Richard's. The attempt of reasoning that determines it can become the setting in the course of a correct reasoning leading to a theorem of internal limitation of the formalism. And so finally, what would bring us to a logical impasse becomes a precise theorem deduced from the formal system in which reviews an obstacle. We can give as an example of Gödel's theorem. Having had the impression of rubbing a precipice, one is finally brought back to results to quite normal. Am I reading Simondon too?
I can take over if you'd like. Could it be said in this case that the fact for logical theory of arriving at a system of supersaturated axioms indicates a possibility of discovery, change of axiomatic but with positive discovery? That is what would emerge from the logical implication. Should I just do both? We should do it back and forth. Someone should do the different voice, just to prevent confusion.
I'll go.
Sure, we can do that. Unless someone else would like to read the other, Mr. Boulika.
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good. Good. Go.
Okay. This is a question whose wording would call for a minute discussion, since the interpretation of the limitation theorems is not easy. Logic and sociology present us with, besides the point mentioned earlier, very different domains.
Yes, I understand. As for the second point, there might perhaps be an explanatory reason for what you said in this difference between the future of physics and the future of the human sciences seeking to be a human science. It is that we have a unity in the domain of man coming from what he is as a species, whereas in the physical realm, we do not have this specific limitation. There may be several domains and not just one field.
So let's stop there for a minute, and we'll just sort of go over what the discussion up to this point has talked about. So it's a little bit difficult to, or it makes things harder to follow because we don't have the text itself. We just have the summary and then the discussion. But in the text, Simondon, and as he just sort of briefly alludes to in the summary, Simondon compares the human sciences with natural science and the way that natural science seems to become more and more unified over the course of the 19th century into the 20th century. And whereas the human sciences are split up into multiple different sciences, and in particular, he points to psychology, sociology, and psychosociology, or sociopsychology, whichever way he puts it. The purpose of the paper, as he puts it, is to try to develop this axiomatics that would allow for a unified human science in the same way that we have a unified natural science. And then so this intervention from Bouligan, I think he is sort of problematizing this idea of a unity of natural science. And he suggests that physical theory is maybe not quite as unified as Simondon has presented it in the paper, and he also points to certain mathematical paradoxes and limitation theorems that in the early 20th century were developed, which sort of put a limit to some of the ideas of the previous generation about the unification of mathematics and of logic. So he's I think pushing back a little bit on Simondon's idea of a unity of natural science, and he suggests that maybe there's actually more unification in the human sciences or the human field than there is in natural science.
Yeah, I think that's the crucial point in that last paragraph. Although it is kind of difficult to parse the grammar as translated here, but when he says, in this difference between the future of physics and the future of the human sciences seeking to be a human science, I think the way that I've kind of grammatically interpreted this is that it's the unity, the additive synthesis of the future of physics and the future of human sciences that is seeking to be a human science. Is that y'all's interpretation?
I think instead, I'm just looking at the French text now. So one point that's not translated is that, so he says one human science with emphasis. So he says, yes, I understand. As for the second point, there might be an explicative reason to what you said. With this difference between the becoming of physics and the becoming of human sciences seeking to be one human science.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, that's just my translation on the fly. But yeah, so one is in italics. It's emphasized there.
So it should be translated in English as a single human science or something, a unitary human science, or more just one human science rather than just to be a human science, just for emphasis, I guess. But I think after a couple of readings of it, I gathered what he was saying, that there's this becoming of physics and the becoming of the human sciences, and he sees them united in a unitary human science.
I don't think he sees the becoming of physics and of human sciences together in one human science. What he's talking about is, so he talks about the difference between the future of physics. So he thinks that the future of physics involves this unification, and then the future of human sciences is still seeking to be a human science, a single human science, or a one unified human science. So he emphasizes the difference between the two here.
So I guess it would be more like the difference between, on one side, the future, the becoming of physics, and the other side, the nascent becoming of the human sciences that is still seeking to be a human science, but isn't really there yet, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a good paraphrase of what he's getting across.
Is that was kind of like the alternate interpretive model. It was either that one of those two that could have been implied by the grammar. I thought that was slightly ambiguous, but I don't want to go off too much on that.
Right, but he sort of specifies that in so he accepts the idea, or he doesn't push back on Bouligand's claim that physics is not as unified as Simondon had presented it in his paper. But he suggests that in the realm of human science, the requirement for unity is different than in physics or in natural science in general, because the human domain is unified in itself. So there's a sort of need for a unification of human science insofar as the human domain is unified. Whereas in the physical realm, there's so he says there may be several domains and not just one field. So it's there's no sort of objective unification in the physical realm that would require that our theoretical reflection of that realm should also be unified.
Yeah, very interesting. Should we move on, I guess, or does anyone else have any questions in those sections?
Yeah, I think we can go on to the next set of back and forth.
I can read. Mr. Pierre-Maxime Schul. I think that the direction in which Mr. Simondon pursues his research is one of the most interesting and fruitful of those which can tempt philosophers today. I think they have a lot of interest in thinking not only about the notions of Gestalt and the problems of cybernetics, but also experiences like Stephen Wolf's, and about the notion of critical point and change of state in crystallography, and also on the notion of field, to which Émile Breillet attached so much importance in the last lines he wrote. What I would fear in such an effort is that sometimes, instead of leading to a useful transposition, we remain on the plane of metaphysics. There is a great danger. On the other hand, as far as the interpretation of the Platonic idea is concerned, we must be careful not to be fooled by the often mythical form of Plato's exposition. It appears much closer to our concerns and those of even Mr. Simondon in certain passages of the Philebus. For example, to see what he says about the relationship between the limit and the unlimited, Taylor has been able to relate some mathematical methods of approximation by excess or by default. Perhaps even a certain combination of ideas would not be inconceivable. Mr. Simondon responds, to me, what seems not to be present in Plato's doctrine is the notion of potential energy, potential in a general way, and perhaps there is some contempt, a lack of knowledge about origins of becoming. Is it possible to make a theory of man without considering him as a being, not only who becomes, who is born and who dies, who is degraded, but like a being of which part of the essence is to become, that is, a being towards something? It is especially the notion of tendency that is missing. While searching well in the Philebus, one could find texts that allude to a becoming that leads to being. Genesis eis ousian.
Yeah, there's a couple little points of translation that I don't really like. So when they say experiences, it should be experiments. It's the same word in French, but experiment is a better translation there.
How is experiment and experience the same word in French? Sorry, that's so fascinating. Yeah. It's just one of those weird terms that both means both of those things.
Yeah, so it's expérience for both, but in this context, experiment is a better translation. So he talks about the experiments of Etienne Wolf. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with Wolf. I'm not sure what exactly those experiments were. That would be something we could try to look up, I guess. And then what does he go on? Yeah, he talks about crystallography, and then Émile Breillet was an early 20th century philosopher of science, French philosopher of science. I don't know much about him, but yeah. So Schul, intervention, I guess, is that he's worried that Simondon might be staying at the level of metaphysics rather than sort of bringing the conceptual content of these scientific developments into philosophy. He thinks that Simondon is maybe staying at the level of metaphysics, and I think the second objection or consideration is related to that, because he thinks that Simondon might have been sort of fooled by these mythical presentations of the doctrine of the ideas in Plato, and that the Philebus is a better guide to the doctrine of ideas than some of the texts that Simondon was relying on.
Just jump in and mention that you mentioned, just read in passing, Etienne Wolf, not Stephen Wolf. It's actually printed Stephen Wolf in my copy, so that's a pretty bad.
Oh yeah, that's what I was thinking. Who is the person you're talking about with this experiment? Because it says Stephen Wolf here. That's very odd. Very odd.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I was looking at the French text and it says Etienne Wolf. So that's very strange that they would change the name. I'm just trying to remember that text itself. But I think the idea is that he points to in that second response there, he points to what he thinks that Simondon should have drawn from Plato, which is this notion of the genesis of beings, genesis e sousian. And he thinks that what Simondon is looking to add to Plato is already in Plato. I think that's the sort of general thesis that he's objecting.
I suppose we should move on, because if we get each one of these people, especially with this strange translation, is going to have their own difficulties in understanding they're getting on about. So maybe we can just keep the momentum, because we only want to do this paper for 2 weeks, right? So we don't want to get stuck, so we're reading it for the next 2 months.
Yeah, I think we can go on to the next back and forth. So we have Jean Val and going back and forth a couple of times with Simondon.
Ooh, I can do the Val part. I like Jean Val. The reflection that I could make would go in the same direction as that of Mr. Schul. That is to say that I will allow myself to recall the role of becoming in the Philebus, to which Mr. Schul referred, because there is the idea of the essences of becoming, the idea of a genemine, I cannot pronounce that word, ousia, I can't pronounce that one either, although I should be able to. That is to say, something called a generation towards essence. Now, you are right. It is not to a man that Plato attributed the tendency to essence. But in the end, the greatest critic of the theory of ideas is Plato, at least the idea as an archetype. It was Plato who asked the most questions about the idea. I greatly admired your books and your presentation, but in a similar way to the one outlined earlier, I wonder whether there's not a danger of transposition into something that is verbal. It is the danger, generally speaking, that is seen on the other side of the Atlantic that we often want to be present. Schema is interesting, but basically perhaps the concrete would have been more interesting. I wonder whether in the idea of good form, there is not a myth. First, one can only know the good form once it has been the right form, that is, after the fact. Besides, for these pre-revolutionary states, too, it is very difficult to study them at that moment, because we have something else to do. Then we will study them only afterwards. They will be interpreted in a different way. I do not know what relationship you will put between them and the good form and the bad form. It is very difficult. I see there a kind of danger in the very idea of a good form, Basically, it is the idea of the Philebus, moreover a Platonic idea, but which perhaps requires a discussion. What does the word good mean in the idea of good form, with the Gestaltists at first and then for you? then, yeah, this is really interesting. It's his critique here is about the idea of that Gestalt unity, that the Gestalt totality being a post hoc kind of justification, and a lot of the reasonings for making these types of post hoc justifications, kind of characterizing them in kind of a prima facie way. But I suspect that Simondon will be drawing this back from the Gestaltists here. Does someone want to read Simondon's response?
Sure, I can do it. We can do a back and forth. So Simondon responds. He says, "Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the French one." Simondon says, "I did not adopt the notion of good form."
Oh, no, you first criticized it.
And Simondon replies, "I presented it by attributing it to the Gestaltists. I said we could not speak of a good form because this good form would be too totalitarian. My intention was precisely to bring a critique of the notion of good form. There is too much optimism in the notion of good form. It is too Leibnizian to a certain extent. I wanted to say that there was always risk and danger, that the possible remained open, and if I spoke about pre-revolutionary times, it is because attention can engender the best as the worst. It is a questioning. To a certain extent, then, it is a dramatic theory of the beginning of being that I wanted to present. It is not at all an optimistic theory like that found among the Gestaltists, where everything is for the best in the best of fields, to paraphrase an expression that would be precisely that of Leibniz. The good form is perfect, and it is good for everyone. It is good in every way and for all things. And that I do not believe. And there can be competition between different forms, just as an intervening crystalline germ can crystallize a metastable field in one way or another. And there may be several species of crystalline germs capable of bringing about crystallization. It all depends on which one falls, and there exists a phenomenon of chance. In the same way, the form that arises from a tense state is not necessarily the best possible, and we never know which one would be the best possible."
Okay, can I say something? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
So this last paragraph actually makes me think of the situation with the vaccines that's currently happening or is in progress, especially around the notion around intervening crystalline germ can crystallize a metastable field in one way or another. And this whole rebuttal, or it just makes me think about the process that science may have, or these companies that are doing this bioengineering and molecular engineering, the types of processes, very intense, cutting-edge scientific processes, but that are still risky, where we don't know exactly what the fall would be. It all depends on which one falls, and there exists a phenomenon of chance. In the same way, the form that arises from a tense state is necessarily the best possible. We never know which one would be the best possible. So it makes me think a lot about empirical methodologies, and think that Jean Wall may have kind of ignored the idea of the emergence towards the good form, and that various nuances and methodologies are still a process of experimenting until they have the good form, and then there's a multiplicity of that, or a plurality of good forms. And yeah, so I was just thinking about the optimization, or the fact that empirical methodologies have kind of evolved to more optimum ways of doing what I think Simondon is referring to.
Well, here I think your example set is extremely relevant here, because we have this idea of a vaccine as kind of ad hoc good form, right? The vaccine is the concern here is that there would be like a totalizing function, right? This is the fear of these totalizing ways of thinking, in which we will want to take a vaccine because it is good to take the vaccine rather than not take it. And
Yeah, but
in so doing,
in terms of the perspective of the scientists that are developing the vaccine, there is a demand, obviously, but apart from that, the way that they go about, formulating and committing to the creation of a vaccine, I think is less totalitarian than maybe the politics around the vaccine.
Right, but I think Jean Vol here, his worry is manifest in your worry here, so to speak. That he's worried about the idea of that Gestalt totality could kind of subvert the more complex, kind of functional framework, which would be the one that you were mentioning of the various different research projects and the different viabilities of different vaccines and different methods and models. And so Simone Doan is quick to retort that, no, in fact, he does not insist on this good form. This is not that his writing is in sense a critique of this totalizing function. And I think that this is definitely the case from what our readings were previously on Simone Doan, that he has his theory of kind of concretization leaves a certain the linearity of function an open question, so that different recontextualizations are possible. So there's a certain kind of freedom involved in that wouldn't be necessarily free within just the Gestalt totality, right? So he wants to kind of make sure that there is this consideration in due course of the kind of more broad domain of functional explanation. So what function is, he doesn't want to think, oh, it's like a stimulus response, like this functions for that, and then we have the good form. I think he points back towards this. I forget the exact term, so I'm maybe here, non-manifest. Do you want to take over for me for a second, because I think I forgot the terms about this more Simone Doan related. What is it? Functional something.
I'm not sure precisely what term you're thinking of there, but so the notion of concretization that he develops on the mode of distance of technical objects. So it has to do with the way in which functions are integrated together. So in an abstract technical object, each component has a single function, and there's a sort of one-to-one mapping of components to functions, and then in the process of concretization, so as the technical object becomes more concrete in the technical lineage, then each component contributes more than one function. So all of the different operations of that component are integrated into the functioning of the technical object as a whole.
Yeah, and I think that kind of describes a lot around the sort of protein modeling, things of that nature that happen now.
That's something that I know next to nothing about, so I can't really comment on that. But it would be interesting to try to apply the notion of concretization to biotechnology, because that was a field that didn't really exist at the time Simone Doan was writing. So that would be another interesting extension of his work.
Of course, we had the medical tradition, and that was, I guess that's what stood in for biotechnology at the time.
Yeah, I mean, of course, if you take technology in a broader sense, you can even talk about, animal breeding and plant breeding and so on as a kind of biotechnology, of course. But referring specifically to molecular biology, I think was sort of just developing at the time that Simone Doan was writing. So there was no, it didn't exist as an industrial field in the way that it does today.
When did this panel take place? Do you know?
Was it the 1950s?
1956, I think. Let me just check.
I think it was 1960 from the PDF.
Yes, yeah, it's 1960. That's right.
All right, so that's an interesting question around where it was situated in terms of the empirical sciences that were happening around them. I mean, it seems that the focus in terms of natural science is physics, but even in the late 50s and 60s, there was still biophysics going on then.
Yeah, I think, and then of course there were vaccines at that time as well, which would be the kind of crucial, relevant historical continuity that would be related to your example set. And I think it is good to think, let's conceive of vaccines as a technical object and organize our understanding of them in the way that Simondon would talk about technical objects in relation to concretion and the kind of the functional integration problem. And I think this is I guess I wish you had been with us for like the last few months, Aeon, because then you would be like, you would have this, like, you would have it exact and know exactly what was going on. But for Simondon, he wants to give a kind of independence to the evolution of the technical object, so that the functions which we conceive of it playing a role related to are not the ones that, not necessarily the functions which will end up constituting the technical object in its more evolved form. So it's a kind of independent, an independence theory of technical evolution.
Yeah, so I think we can go on to the next set of back and forth with Gabriel Marcel.
I can read the Marcel. I completely agree with Schul and Jean Val. The question I'm asking is this: it seems to me that you cannot escape the reproach of those who accuse you of falling into the metaphor if you really start from an ontology in the most precise sense of the word, that is, a theory of the elements of being. It seems to me that if you do not posit a kind of substructure ontological in the most precise sense of the word, then we can always tell you that you are making simple comparisons that may be misleading. But then there I will evoke a philosophy that I know extremely badly and which is never again considered. But it seems to me that the problem has been posed quite similarly to yours in a Herbartian philosophy. And I would like to know if there's anyone here who knows enough about Herbart's thinking to see how close this relationship is. It seems to me that there is precisely a dynamic of the elements of being, and a dynamic which in certain sense is of Platonic origin. Should I keep going? Just read the response.
Sure.
Simondon, I do not know the thought of Herbart. As for the reproach which consists in saying that I do not begin with a study of being, I believe that this is impossible. And I tried at the beginning to say it. In fact, when we study man, we always remain at the level of correlations because there is no possible reduction of the individual being to a subset that would really be the element. There's no group of groups either. Neither the totality nor the indivisible is possible in man. An ontology in the case of man would be an anthropology, but I do not think that anthropology is possible. It is the postulate.
Apparently, I have an oversight. I'd never heard of this guy before, and he has a giant Stanford encyclopedia article.
Yeah, I don't think he's actually that interesting, to be honest. The little bit that I've read of him I don't think it's an accident that he's become forgotten by history.
Are you talking about Marcel or Herbart?
Herbart. Yeah, I mean, he's sort of known in educational theory, I think, more than in philosophy. But I don't know what his educational theory was. But in philosophy, he developed a theory of differential representations. So he was connected in some respects with the psychophysics school in the 19th century.
Huh.
And he, I mean, I guess the one sort of interesting contribution is he tried to make sense of what it would mean for there to be unconscious representations, but not in a Freudian sense, but just in the sense that there would be representations that are below the threshold of consciousness, and how a representation can pass over or under that threshold. But I'm not really sure what connection Marcel is drawing with Herbart here, because he says he doesn't really know him. But so I don't know what exactly the connection that he's trying to draw is.
Yeah, I think it's kind of impenetrable from the text. It's kind of like, does anyone know about this guy? And everyone's like, no. But I found it interesting that he was around in Jena at around the same time that it seems like Hegel was writing phenomenology, perhaps. And Hegel, of course, is a very interesting kind of in pedagogical circles, I suppose, as well. So maybe there's some little bits there and pieces that might be interesting for maybe a historian of philosophy or something.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not being very fair, I guess, when I say that he is rightly forgotten, but I would just say that I haven't found from the little bits of what I've read of his work that doesn't seem especially interesting, but maybe there are other aspects that are more interesting than what I've found.
There's an interesting substrate here that they keep alluding to, which, although he's not being mentioned by name and there's a reference back to Plato, it seems that the question around being is coming up a lot in a kind of Heideggerian sense. They're not mentioning Heidegger, but supposing that that some of the controversy is around taking being into account and what is being and the becoming question as it relates to being. And so it just makes me think of Heidegger. And Heidegger was a big influence, I think, or at least somebody has pointed out that he may have been and had a foothold in the French schools of philosophy during the post-war era, even though there's talk around a Nietzschean explosion as well, but I think Heidegger was kind of pinnacle that many had to deal with in the French school. So this question around being is coming up a lot here.
Yeah, I always think of being as like the kind of currency of philosophy, so to speak. So I just kind of assume that everything is always about being in all of my inquiry. I'm not sure if there's much that we can say about like how being. I mean, do you think that Simondon has a particular characterization of being in it, or? I don't know what to make of this in the sense of like a lot of authors with systems will specifically talk about being, like Heidegger, Hegel, etc. But I don't know if I recall Simondon really kind of entering into that kind of model of explication.
We'll see more when we get into the individuation book. He does talk about being and ontology in that book, basically in the introduction and conclusion. But I'm not too sure whether, I mean, Heidegger is definitely an important reference point for, post-World War II French philosophy. I'm not sure whether Heidegger is what they have in mind here when they talk about being. I just say that because, in Plato already, there's discussion of being and how being and non-being are related and so on. So I'm a little bit, I think it's probably more a Platonic reference than a Heideggerian one when they talk about being here.
Okay, so just in general, what's the sort of gravitation that they're doing towards that in questioning Simondon's position? Keep kind of pulling him towards.
I read it kind of as the difference between the distinction that I guess we're going to learn in depth between the ontological and the ontogenetic, basically, between coming up with a kind of metaphysical schema for being versus sort of beginning from a postulate rather than an axiom or something like that, or kind of like beginning from his sort of strategy of postulation rather than to sort of lay out a whole system.
Yeah. It's always the being and becoming, I suppose. Even more famous pair than being and on-being, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's interesting in Simondon's reply here, where he says, "Oh, an ontology in the case of man would be an anthropology, but I don't think an anthropology is possible." So he's distancing himself from a project of the anthropology in maybe something like the Heideggerian sense of a fundamental anthropology. So he doesn't think that there is such a thing as an ontology of the human being, and he's distancing himself from that project. So what he's doing is not or shouldn't be understood as an ontology in that sense. We're just about at 2 hours, but I'm just taking a look. There's more back and forth with Marcel and going back and forth with Simondon. It's probably too long to finish for today, so maybe we should stop here, and we can pick up with the rest of what their back and forth is next time, and then we should be able to finish the rest of the dialogue.